Hello, my name is Christina Rinaldi from the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Alberta, and today I'm going to be discussing the importance of supporting social and emotional learning in schools from K through 12 and the research that backs up the findings with regard to social and emotional learning. So just a little brief overview. Today I'm going to present a review of arguments in favor of supporting social and emotional learning, what we know about social and emotional learning across developmental stages and grades, so explicitly K to 12, and the summary of the research findings on SEL programming and the relationships to academic, social, emotional, mental health, and life outcomes. So where to begin? We all have hopes and dreams for children, adolescents, and our students. So when parents, families, teachers, and even just the community at large, when we ask them questions about what do we want our children to become, what do we want for our children in general in life, we often get things like responses like we want them to be knowledgeable, we want them to be responsible, we want them to be caring, respectful, caring and socially responsible and competent. And so when you hear those goals, as well as happy and healthy, they're pretty lofty. And then you're trying to figure out, so how do we best support those outcomes for our children and adolescents? And how do we align that? And where does education come into play? So what are the goals of education? A lot of educators, as well as all these different stakeholders, will say they might use different words, but really at the core and common focus of it is that students need to be lifelong learners, they need to be adaptable, and they need to be contributing citizens. So again, large goals for educational outcomes. And how can we achieve those? Well, if you think about social and emotional learning and the core competencies, we see a really nice alignment between the kinds of skills that can be taught, the kinds of curriculum objectives that SEL programs endorse, and tying that to those lifelong outcomes that, as I mentioned, family, educators, and society at large really hope for children and adolescents who we say obviously are the adults of tomorrow, are our leaders of tomorrow. So a brief review of those core competencies put forth by the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. Self-awareness. So what we're talking about here is the ability to accurately recognize one's emotions and thoughts and their influences on others. And when we're talking about building self-awareness, we're talking about that in kindergarten and grade 1. Knowing that there's others around you, knowing how you feel and responding to different kinds of situations. And we see that that is an important skill in those early years, in middle school or junior high, but also in high school levels. It's just the context obviously evolve. With regard to self-management, we're looking at the ability to regulate one's emotions, thoughts, and behaviors effectively. So when we think about what happens for children and adolescents, we're talking about managing stress, controlling impulses, motivating yourself, oneself, working and setting achieving personal and academic goals. Those personal and academic goals, again, maybe not articulated by first graders, but they're different. It might be being able to get through a lesson, sitting still, paying attention, cooperating with others. And then if we jump ahead just for an extreme in the high school grades, what we're looking for is managing the stress of many different competing demands on our time, higher stakes in academic performance, pressure from not only your peers, but also your possibly family. And then we move to social awareness. Having that skill is the ability to take the perspective and empathize with others of diverse backgrounds. So giving students exposure to different kinds of ways of being and knowing and understanding different perspectives from the student body that they interact with, from the teachers that they interact with on a day-to-day basis. Relationship skills is another core competency that's really important and has been identified. And we see that permeate all aspects of educational but also home life. The ability to establish and maintain, and we hear this concept of healthy relationships and rewarding relationships, which we can see is important in a school climate and also in personal one-on-one interactions. And then finally, responsible decision making, and it's really important also when we are thinking about these core competencies that I am always referring to, and it always needs to be really relative to what stage of development children are at. So when we're talking about responsible decision making, are you able to make constructive and respectful choices about personal behavior and social interactions? How does a 7-year-old take personal responsibility versus a 16-year-old taking personal responsibility for making decisions and building the skills that they need in order to be able to do that. So when we talk about social emotional learning, it is why it is so popular, but also it has grand appeal, is because it is a student-centered approach that teaches students about skills about how to satisfy not only their own personal self-needs, but also the needs of others. And this is a key definitional piece to what does it mean to be competent, socially and emotionally competent. It means being able to get along with others, but also being able to meet your own needs and be satisfied and able to meet those personal goals as well. So it's really a fine balance of being able to do both those things. So again, why is it so appealing? The SEL framework is a little different in that it is strengths-based. So it really focuses on what students can do. And what we work towards is providing them with skills that benefit them in day-to-day activities and contexts. But it is also grounded in developmental theory. In other words, I keep giving you these examples of what it means to be a 7-year-old versus what it means to be a 10-year-old. And it's more complicated than that. Not all 10-year-olds are the same and not all 7-year-olds are the same. However, it is really important to understand where the students are at with respect to their social and emotional learning, and that perhaps the context around them, for instance, the peer pressure is different at 7 than it is at 10 than it is at 16. And so context, in addition to what kids are experiencing themselves, really focuses on that developmental kind of acknowledgement and appreciation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about general student outcomes and what we know. So we know that social and emotional competencies are connected to early learning success and school readiness. There are studies that have shown this connection time and time again. We also know that greater social emotional competence increases the likelihood, and this is what school districts and also parents and educators really want to hear, is that it increases the likelihood of high school completion, readiness for post-secondary, but in addition to post-secondary, other life and career choices as well, positive family and work relationships, better mental health, and engaged citizenship. So if we take a step to a few slides back, or just think about the kinds of things when we were talking about hopes and dreams of what is it that our families and educators really envision for children and youth, they are looking for this engaged citizenship. They are looking for them to be successful so that they can be contributing members of society. And here we have a direct connection to those exact markers and outcomes. Conversely, we found in the literature the absence of competencies. So when the competencies aren't there, when those social, emotional, and if we wanted to even look at the broader list that I mentioned, self-awareness, ability to have healthy relationships, all of that, when those aren't there, the opposite is has been documented. So high school dropout rates and adult unemployment and more difficulty and higher rates of mental health problems. So now I'm going to take a little bit of time to focus on early learning, elementary years, going into junior high and high school, and the results specifically that have been attached to these particular grade groupings. So what do I really need to learn in kindergarten? And I'd say in grades 1 to 6, which is in the elementary years. What do we really need to teach? So if we look at social and emotional learning competencies, we need to teach a whole group of skills that basically deal with the self-awareness, the monitoring, the ability to control and regulate, the ability to get along with others, the ability to manage stress, as I mentioned. These social and emotional learning components are predictive of classroom adjustment and academic success as early as kindergarten years. When we talk to kindergarten or early grade teachers, we hear that academic abilities are quite important. We're not saying that they're not, but they also say we're looking for children who are able to get along with others, who are able to take direction, who are able to focus and work in groups and work with the teacher and build those positive relationships. So what comes through in the early years is self-regulation, inhibitory control, understanding of emotions, so even being able to label emotions, and the ability to social problem solve for that age level, and basic kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2 relationship skills. These are all indicative of early academic success. So there is a connection. So when people, or whether it's parents or educators, are saying we're really interested in the academic performance, the success rates for our students, we can start to make the argument that, well, focusing on these other kinds of skills, self-regulation, inhibitory control, all of these that are subsumed under the social emotional learning kinds of skills and competencies actually leads to better academic outcomes. And I think the research in the early years here is quite strong on that. With respect to later elementary and junior high, it is a unique developmental stage. Anybody who knows the 10 to 14 age group, also common words, tweens, they are a group unto themselves. They are interesting because they are going through biological, physiological changes, cognitive changes as well, and they have to manage all of that in addition to some of those social emotional competencies that we're looking at. So if we look at milestones, what we hope and expect this age group to be mastering is the ability for conscious self-control, the ability to abide by rules. So in classroom settings, what are classroom rules? What are the rules of the school in general? Capable of using language to regulate behavior and influence others. We're expecting them to have high peer interest and involvement. We're expecting to see cooperative interactions with others. We're hoping that they also have the ability to use problem-focused rather than emotion-focused strategies. So to break down problems without being guided by emotion completely. The ability to really learn from discussions, and you can see connections straight to curriculum implications here, and to be able to play games with rules. So all of these kinds of things are typical milestones. At the same time, these are the competencies if children haven't or if students haven't met them, we would want to be targeting in our social emotional learning programming. We also know that the competencies in junior high students significantly predict present and future grade and achievement scores. So I presented some early learning findings. Now with the elementary and junior high groupings, we're finding the same kinds of pattern of results, that social emotional learning competencies are related to academic achievement. So in their review of classroom-based social emotional learning programs, Jaggers and colleagues found that 2 SEL programs fit the criteria for evidence-based. And the criteria that they put forth, which is also on the CASEL website as far as their guidebooks of what they qualify as evidence-based, is that there needs to be scientific studies that, that find effective outcomes in at least 3 independent studies, 3 or more. And therefore, the 2 programs they found that actually met that criteria were the Life Skills Training Program and the Responding in Peaceful and Positive Ways program. They also found several promising programs, although few programs have been used to have actually been replicated more than 3 times, but there are promising programs. They just haven't been evaluated using randomized control trials or other kind of experimental designs. So the life skills training, it really increases the refusal skills and decreases substance abuse and fighting, delinquency, anxiety, behaviors like risky driving, which is something that junior high students are starting to think about, improved assertiveness, improved decision making, and problem solving. The Responding in Peaceful and Positive Ways program showed also decreases in substance use, aggression and violent behavior, delinquent behavior, school code violations, decreased peer pressure and use of drugs, physical aggression, substance abuse, and increased life satisfaction. So these were all the different kinds of outcomes that they measured and found positive effects. When we turn our attention to high school, there is less research in this area on this demographic specifically, but they are distinct from the junior high group. Still going through physiological and biological changes, but we also see a jump in cognitive processing with later adolescence. They might be looking for more reward-seeking behaviors, and this can lead to decreased self-regulation. So from a developmental perspective, really understanding this age group, it's a tricky age group in the sense that we really, when we see a lot of high school students, physically, they start to resemble adults. And you're thinking, this person certainly has the capacity of adult thinking, but they don't. Okay? They do have increased capacity for social cognition and perspective taking. However, they don't always apply it to all contexts and under all situations. So faced with more high stakes in decision making, the high school student may, and this is certainly not an exhaustive list, just the ones that people say causes them not to lose sleep at night. They drive. They're possibly taking driver's ed. They might be working part-time jobs. They could be dating. They have different kinds of peer choices. So if they're dating but also have to hold social relationships, and we're talking about possibly increased responsibilities if they are on sports teams, if they are involved in extracurricular, if they're involved in anything extra to the school curriculum. And then that all leads to increased time demands. So put that into perspective of those physiological, biological changes that are also going on. And it can be a very exciting time, but it can also be a very tumultuous time for what's going on for students at that point. So prime time for social emotional learning competencies to come back, not come back, hopefully they've never left the picture, but to be in the picture. So what we found, or what we hope, is that equally important is to foster these competencies that are matched for developmental stage and learning needs. So what would be advantageous is to focus on interventions that really do look at self-awareness, that's self-management, social self-awareness, relationship skills, and then again, responsible decision-making that all apply to help building assets and resiliency. So very positive focused of strengths building of what do the adolescents, what do the students bring to situations, how can they refine and build build upon the foundational skills that they've received all along in their development. So often we do hear how youngsters or kindergartners are learning how to share, how to take turns, how to stand in line, how to wait until it is, whether it's the washroom, whether it's snack time, whether it's storytelling time. What does that look like for adolescents, for 15, 16, 17-year-olds? What does it mean to wait your turn? What does it mean to be able to deal with successes but also failures? When your team doesn't win the championship, when you don't get the scholarship that you want, when you're not sure what path you're going to take because you're not sure of the options, and perhaps there's a lot of financial strain or other kinds of things going on in your life. How do we build assets and resiliency? So in our high school data, the research that's been conducted here, few evidence-based programs have actually been researched with these higher grades. However, in a review conducted by Williamson, there were promising programs. So again, promising programs means that there were significant findings and results. They just didn't meet the criteria of having independent reviews, experimental design, randomized control trials that were replicated 3 or more times. But the promising reviews, because that's all we have at the moment, is that this is what they found across programs. They found that when high school programs did have some form of social emotional learning implementation program, they found increased achievement, decreased attention, decrease in intent to use substances, an increase in emotional competence. They also found increased positive teacher-rated behavior. They found increased school engagement, decreased dropout, increase in positive identity, which we know is a core area for a lot of adolescents, is who am I, what am I going to be? In speaking with adolescents, they get asked probably by every person they meet, what are you going to do? What are you interested in? What are you applying for? What are your plans for the next few years? So increased positive identity and an increased sense of self and decision making, which is paramount to that educational stage of life. So having gone through the 3 different, and they're huge grade levels, but we're talking early, middle, and later grade from K to 12. If we take a step back, what are some overall findings and summaries? We know that SEL and effective school-based interventions do exist. There is a strong connection. So SEL programming, we know, promotes students' academic success. This has been replicated in several studies. We have correlational and longitudinal research demonstrating that SEL competencies are positively correlated to good adjustment outcomes and negatively to programs. So these are overall global takeaway messages that we know about the programming. And in one particular meta-analysis, which is a study that reviews the effects and the impact of other studies conducted by Durlak and colleagues, they basically review 213 studies involving over 270,000 students from kindergarten to high school. More programs were at the kindergarten to junior high level. A few included in their review were from high school, although fewer proportionally. But nonetheless, revealed that compared to students who did not receive any social emotional learning competency programming, the ones who did showed gains in academic performance, which is what is the primary question we get asked from districts, SEL skills, pro-social behaviors, and attitudes towards self and others. So if we go back to what do we hope for our children and youth, and we want them to be engaged citizens, we want them to be productive, we want them to have mastered different areas of academic competence as well, this seems to be lining up quite nicely. But there's still more work to be done. And this is what brings us to our conclusion. Looking ahead, we have work to do with the schools and districts. And of course, governments and research institutions as well can all contribute. One important point is the environmental context. So how do we go about using this evidence and knowing the successful connections between SEL programming and outcomes? So how do we implement evidence-based SEL programming? Well, we need to consider classroom factors, we need to consider school climate, we need to consider teacher practices, and we need to consider homeschool partnerships. So with regard to the classroom practices, we need to know what is being embedded specifically in the curriculum. Is there an implementation and quality implementation of the programming? With respect to the school climate, are there specific policies that help guide and facilitate and contribute to positive culture with respect to whether it's discipline or technology policies or just how to endorse healthy relationships in schools and safe and caring environments? How can we support teachers in their implementation of programming? And how do we communicate and also support strong homeschool partnerships? It's important for us to go and look at research and gather additional, everybody says that, but the reason why we have to gather additional information on our programming for specific student competencies is to know, for instance, what works with high school students, which programs can we implement, and especially since this is the particular grade levels where this has not been implemented as much, and yet we know that they can definitely benefit from more hands-on skills training as they are getting more complex social problems tied to higher stakes academic concerns. Research in these areas and partnering with schools and districts to implement those evidence-based programming is going to be key. And then finally, when we're talking about partnering with the community, the schools, the districts, and bringing provincial ministries and research training institutions together to systematically evaluate the programs and understand the core principles of social and emotional learning and how we can facilitate that wide-based. We know that having that unified vision is important. But I think we really can end on a positive note, knowing that a strengths-based, skills-based approach of how to foster improvement in social emotional competencies for children and adolescents really does have long-term outcomes, and definitely an area where we should be investing more. Thank you.